best I told you so moment. Story 1, I was in freight. I delivered a pallet that was supposed to have 750 pieces. It looked a little short, so I asked the customer to count it. He refused 3 times after I explained to him if it was short, they're going to deny your claim. He said, don't worry. I said, okay, noted it on the paperwork that he refused to count. He signed it. 2 weeks later, he called the customer service rep to report a shortage, make a claim. The customer service rep called me, asked, did I remember it? I said, yep, read the notes. She said, oh, he refused to count it. Claim denied, thanks, bye. LOL. Story 2. Ex-boss, who I was not fond of, had a vehicle he wanted to sell. He met someone who wanted to make payments on it, used private party, but take possession when they made the first payment. I told him not to do it. I said it was almost certain they will crash the car and then just stop paying and be left with a damaged car and no money. He told me I was dumb and went ahead with the deal. Okay, whatever you say. For a couple months, things were good and he was pretty smug. Then he comes in one day and tells me to research what happens if the above scenario happens, and the car was in a tow yard collecting fees. He wanted to know if he was responsible for the fees. I didn't even look up. Yup, if you want the car back, you are. In the late 80s, I worked for my MIL as a regional manager of her business. I worked very long hours for 500 WK. At some point, I told her that I deserved a raise. She asked me how much I thought that I deserved, and I replied that she couldn't replace me for less than 1,000 WK. She responded that she was sure that she could, so I said, fine, show me. She had trouble finding someone and finally had to pay the 1,000. But after 2 weeks, he was totally incapable of doing what I did. So she had to split it into 2 regions and hire a second guy at 1,000 WK. After 6 months, she discovered that they teamed up to embezzle about 15,000. Of course, she never acknowledged to anyone, especially not me, that I was right and she up badly. Story 3. Working at a tire shop, customer bring in a Land Rover Range Rover with air suspension for a set of tires. I watch the tire changers start to set their little scissor lift under the frame to pick it up, and I go over and stop them. I tell them that they should take it down to the second drive-on rack and use the swing jacks under the axles, or else they're going to blow out the suspension. The assistant manager overhears this and comes out into the shop saying that I just called Land Rover and they said that to turn off the air ride, all you have to do is open the rear hatch and turn the hazard lights on. Just pick it up where it is and get on with it. The customer's waiting. At that point, I said, well, you heard the man. I'm going to go back down by my toolbox. Holler if you need me. About a minute and a half later, what sounds like a shotgun blast is heard throughout the shop. They lifted the truck by the frame and blew out all 4 suspension airbags, just like I said would happen. They eventually wound up putting it on the drive-on lift and using the swing jacks, just like I told them to do. Then the customer got to drive all the way from Manassas, VA to Alexandria, VA, on the bump stops where the shop I was working for paid $6,000 for a set of used suspension airbags to be installed. God forbid the guy who's actually worked on Land Rovers before might know what he's talking about, even if I had only been at that particular shop for 3 days. At least they started listening to me when I told them stuff. Story 4. When I was in high school 15 years ago during a basketball game, the coach pulled me out and berated me for not boxing out the opponent for a rebound. I did box her out and I knew it, so I talked back to him. We really got into it. That really ticked him off, so I didn't go back in the rest of the game. The next Monday at school, he pulled me into his office and said he watched the game film over the weekend and apologized because I did indeed box her out. Story 5. Booked a flight to Bangkok with a canceling insurance, and almost all of my friends laughed why'd I spend extra money on such thing. They weren't laughing. March 2020. Story 6. When I was waitressing in college, I got seated a man and a woman together for lunch. When I asked what they wanted to drink, the woman put down the drink menu, sighed, and said, just a water. The man ignored me and said something like, and another thing, complaining about something loudly. He was switching from English into Spanish and back, and I just zoned out for about 30 seconds, until I asked if I should give them a minute to decide. Dude turns to me like he's just seeing me. I was 21, with a tanning bed tan and color in blonde hair. I also worked a double the day before. He smirks and says to the woman, this is what I'm talking about. Look at her. I bet she doesn't know one question off the test and she was born here. Why should I learn it? The woman apologizes and explains they just come from taking the US naturalization test and they would both have waters. I grab their waters and they are still arguing when I come back. I set the drinks down and turn to walk away when the man says, hold on. To his friend he says, no, I want to prove a point. He then turns to me and asks, do you think you could pass the test to be a naturalized US citizen? I said probably, but I know that I'd love to take their order for them. Guy wasn't happy. Anyway, I get it, tests are annoying. But he's wired into it by now, and finally stands up upset and says, fine, say, The Preamble to the Constitution. Fellow Americans who had an insane social studies teacher in 8th grade who made you memorize the preamble to pass their class, stressed about it, and thought they'd never make it to high school, this one is for you. I hadn't thought of the preamble since then, probably. But baby, my public school middle school 8th grade teacher was right, y'all. I would need to know this important information later in life. It was my time to shine. I preamble the absolute out of that preamble. The preamble was preambling. Didn't even have to Schoolhouse Rock sing it. It was like those 52 words were now a part of my DNA. I also stood up straight and stared off at attention to nothing, which I'm sure added to this pinnacle of my college career. The woman clapped when I was done. The man sat down hard and turned away from me. I then looked back at them and said, "Now, can I please take your order?" It was perfect. A bald eagle landed on my shoulder. Uncle Sam cried. Okay, no, but the woman said screw it and ordered beer and pizza while he sat angry and silent. I got 20 tip, and the privilege of sharing this important information learned in school, also on par with, but not quite as important as mitochondria being the powerhouse of the cell. It was a good day. Story 7. As a teacher, telling the head principal at my school that the way they were abusing the alternate assessment program to boost standardized test scores was not just a huge burden on teachers, but also illegal and likely to attract the scrutiny of the State Department of Education. He handed me a shitty assignment for the next year. I quit. And he ended up having to take that assignment teaching 16 kids with emotional disorders across 3 grade levels in one classroom for the first month and a half of the school year BC. They couldn't find anybody to take my place. I heard later that year that they came down hard on him for the scheme he'd concocted and ended up shutting down the alternative assessment program altogether. Told you so, DL. Story 8. When I was 13 years old, I found out my brother was selling drugs out of my parents' house. He used to tell them he was giving away McDonald's coupons that he got from working the drive-thru. We lived in a very nice neighborhood, and I knew the influx of cars would attract police attention. After asking him to stop several times, I finally caved and told my parents. I was literally in tears because I felt guilty snitching on him, but felt like I had no other choice because he was going to ruin his life. When I told my parents, they accused me of being jealous of him for having better grades in school and called me a liar. He was able to continue on for 2 years before finally getting caught. Our home was raided, and he was on the 5 o'clock news that evening. My mother watched and sobbed, and I couldn't help. But say I told you so, what could have been an easy conversation ended in federal charges and several $100,000 in lawyer fees. Story 9. Family friend's truck was making a grinding noise from the brakes. Told him to drive something else to go hunting. Got a call the next day because he drove it 2 hours and then his brakes stopped working. He ended up needing calipers on top of the pads and rotors he would have originally needed. Story 10. My dad had a rule that if he worked on the car, we had to be with him. Use the manual and help. He gave me the manual. The manual said it was the relay. I told him that. He said I read it wrong and didn't follow the if this then this correctly. We replaced the battery. It didn't start. We replaced the starter. It didn't work. We replaced alternator. It didn't work. We went to the repair shop. They replaced the relay. It worked. I loved my dad. I knew a bit more about cars and other household stuff than most girls. But Mom and I still have a laugh over that story and the clutch, which is a whole other story. Story 11. My roommate at the time always refused to take his keys whenever he left the house, despite me telling him not to do that, relying on the fact that I always had mine. Our shifts ended around the same time, so we would usually come home together. One day, whilst we were both out, I had to go back to my parents' house, which was a couple hours away. As I was pulling up to their drive, I get a call from him, stranded in the rain, outside our place without his keys. I told him that I wouldn't be returning until tomorrow and that there was nothing I could do. He ended up staying over at one of our friends' houses. But since then, he's never left the house without his keys. Story 12. I was a contractor managing stormwater ponds. Happy to field questions on the topic. Cattails are usually bad because they grow so aggressively they'll clog inflow-outflow pipes and take up the flood storage volume. Also often are a monoculture with little ecological value. I had a manager I supervised who kept saying, "We don't have to sub that out to some company. I can rent an excavator and get all the cattails out, roots and all." He was a sketchy mechanic sort of character. Always had a MacGyver solution, always was double-dipping with work equipment. I finally approved his scheme to rent a Mini X. Guess who gets a Tim? I up FaceTime 15 minutes later. Me. I drive across the state to get on site and see he's submerged the excavator in the pond and ran it so water sucked up the intake. We had to daisy chain 2 F-350s to the tow truck to tow the thing 6 feet. He ended up buying it from the rental place and repairing it and flipping it. Story 13. When my younger brother fell through the ice while crossing a creek when we were kids around 11 and 9. It was only slightly higher than knee-deep on us and slow-moving, so not a high risk of drowning. However, a very uncomfortable 12-mile walk back to the house in 45F weather. I told him the ice was too thin to cross there, and we could cross maybe 300 up steam where it was ankle-deep water that was still frozen pretty solid. But I wasn't the boss of him. 4 steps later and he's up to his armpits because he landed on his butt on the creek bed. What made it better was the entire whining walk home. He thought he would be in big trouble with my mom. However, one look at the waddling, pitiful mess, and Mom broke out in laughter as she helped him out of the clothes. It gets funnier. He was mad that she wasn't mad, and was shouting about how it's not funny and why isn't he in trouble. Isn't he grounded or something? Which leads to Mom running out of breath because she's laughing so hard now. He ends up storming to his room without being sent there. Story 14. Told X. I was passing a kidney stone and needed to go to the ER urgent care. She told me to it up, and that it was just a bit of man flu. Despite the pain, my anger had me drive her and myself to the urgent care, get a CT scan, and have the doctor tell me that it was a 5mm kidney stone halfway to my bladder. The look on her face when he confirmed that I was right was worth the pain and agony. Story 15. I told my ex-wife's new husband that she was a cheater and would do it to him. He said she wouldn't. Forward 5 years, and they're divorced. He tells me she cheated several times for long periods. He tells me he wished he'd listened. Story 16. One time my mom and I were at Walmart and we spotted this woman who looked a lot like my aunt returning a TV. She told me to go get her attention and I said no, that's not my aunt. She said I know my sister and proceeded to yell, "Hey fat woman," and this woman turned and glared. Story 17. I started following when COVID started up in China. It was various stories coming out in bits and pieces, but if you were paying attention then you knew something bad was up. This was early to mid-January. I started telling friends and family about it and saying they needed to start paying attention. They mostly thought I was being dramatic. Then when Italy shut down, they all started to notice. Story 18. When I lived in New Orleans, I knew this insufferably pretentious goth chick from Ohio, or someplace who was absolutely incapable of admitting she wasn't omniscient. She was fixing herself lunch and started blanketing it with cayenne pepper, and I warned her to watch out, since it really is spicy. She rolled her eyes at me, added a bunch more, took one bite, ran into the bathroom too, and didn't talk to anyone for like 2 days. Story 19. I warned my partner that I neither liked nor trusted a friend colleague of his, and gave a detailed list of things that said friend had said or did that rang my alarm bells regarding his arrogance and trustworthiness. My partner brushed it off, saying I'm too sensitive and slightly biased. First chance this guy got, he inflated his abilities and experience in a way that caused an internal company crisis and could get him fired. My partner had a quiet word with him to try to warn him he was making a huge mistake and, in return, got belittled and gaslit in a lengthy blame-shifting message that ended with a jaunty "let's agree to disagree. When are we going for beers?" The best part for me was I didn't even have to say I told you so because my partner was stomping around going, "What an absolute. You were right. You were right all along and I should have listened to you." Story 20. When I was 14, I fell down a flight of stairs and messed up my knee badly enough that I had to have surgery on it. It was a day surgery, and when I came out of anesthesia, I found myself groggy and sick to my stomach. The attending nurse needed to get me up and ready to leave, but I really didn't feel well. So she's insisting that I sit up and am protesting, saying that if I move, I will vomit. She made me sit up, telling me you won't vomit. I promptly puked all over her. Story 21. Dad was setting up one of those CRT rear projection TVs in the living room. I knew that the cable wasn't coming through since he had the wrong channel on, so I went up to tell him, and he started to yell at me to get out of the living room. I came back an hour later to see him still struggling with it. I walked up, changed the channel, and walked away. He was really mad that I got it to work. Story 22. This one happened recently. My dog has been chewing through his leash, and it was on the literal edge of breaking. I told my mom not to use that leash even though it's retractable, because it's going to break. I've been using the short, thick leash, not retractable, because it's harder for the dog to chew through. My mom used the leash, and guess what happened? It snapped. My mom had to close the gate once he got to the backyard. They were at the front, and I had to go outside in my fluffy pajamas to catch the dog. It rained outside recently, so the place was wet. Luckily, he didn't run out into the street, and it was at night. Story 23. One time when my kids were little, I took them apple picking and then stopped at the supermarket with them to pick up a few things. My daughter was still working on an apple when we got in line to pay. A woman behind me said, "I hope she's enjoying that apple because all of us other customers are paying for it." I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "When you steal, the rest of us are paying for it." I told her that we'd just come from apple picking, and she made a face indicating that I was full of it. I paid, went out to my car, and got the kids buckled in. As I was loading the groceries in the trunk, this same woman came out. She was parked right next to us. I pulled the bag of apples out of the trunk to show her and said, "Here you go." I want you to appreciate what you just made of yourself. Story 24. This is a bit of a silly one, but my brother was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from America, and the first time he flew out to see her, I jokingly told him that if he didn't impress the Americans, then they would throw him in the Thunderdome. He just laughed and told me that there was no such thing as a Thunderdome. Anyway, he flies out and her town just happens to have an event called the Thunderdome. I rubbed that in his face for weeks after he came back. Story 25. I was working in a factory that had very large pieces of machinery with large gearboxes, about the size of one of those smart cars. I noticed during my shift that while idling, one of the machines had a small spike in current draw. Every revolution of the motor idle was about 15 RPM, so you could see it on the monitors. I put a screwdriver up against the gearbox casing and listened to it. It's a half-assed stethoscope, and could hear something sticking and then popping free as it turned. I told the supervisor that a bearing was right on the point of failure, and we needed to shut it down immediately for maintenance. He ignored my warning and proceeded to queue up a job for the night shift running at 80 max load for 9 hours. I shrugged and went home. At about 2 a.m., the gearbox failed catastrophically, causing what the crew reported as a small earthquake as the entire building shook. I turned up for my next shift, and once they explained what happened, I just looked at the supervisor and said, "Told you so." The machine was down for nearly a year, and a new gearbox had to be custom fabricated and imported from Italy because they didn't want a couple of days downtime for preventative maintenance. Story 26. Told a gal that her guy best friend was just lurking and waiting for his chance. She didn't believe me. She was at a low point from a breakup, and sure enough, he made a move. Story 27. My little brother and me were biking to the store, and he told me he wanted to try to cross his arms and grab the steering wheel like that. I strongly advised against it. He still did it, and we added Band-Aids to the list of things we had to buy. Story 28. I don't know about my best, but here is one most of us can relate to right now. I predicted that the company I work for would start laying off people because they are too brazen and borrow a ton of money to grow the company. The company is totally LMAO. They have a stupid, unreasonable target, unhappy, talented employees, and they are going to get burned so bad unless they sell the company to another fish. Not even kidding, if like 2 people quit, the whole company will have a domino effect of burnout and collapse. I wouldn't be shocked if it only took one. Investment firms. They take good businesses and them over to make a profit at the expense of everyone else involved. No morality, no empathy. This is why employees need to stick together. We make the company, not them. They will lay off their best employees to save money, only to find out the hard way that they made them the money to begin with. Discuss your salary. Set boundaries together. Loyalty goes both ways. If they are kicking out people and not rewarding their most loyal, then they don't deserve loyalty from you, period. It really sucks when you like working for a company and slowly see it become everything it said it wouldn't be when you joined. My brother inherited a house and decided to sell it to his friend. I told him it's important to make sure his friend goes through a bank, gets a loan, mortgage, all the normal things you would do when selling a house to a stranger. Nope, because it was his friend. He just signed a quitclaim and had a handshake deal with the guy to pay monthly for 30 years. Guess who died a couple years later? And whose wife conveniently forgot the handshake deal? Friend's wife has a nice free house now. Story 29. I had a coworker, well, call her Tina, who proudly stated that she had been drug-free for 6 months, but her boyfriend who lived in their car was still using. She lived in an apartment by herself, but this guy had broken into her place several times looking for stuff to sell for drug money. Another coworker and her boyfriend had been hanging out with Tina. They grew close and offered to let her live with them. I told them that was a bad idea because she hadn't been clean that long, and if her was shady enough to break into her place, what would stop him from breaking into theirs? Their lease was up in just over a month, but they had a new place a couple towns over. They told Tina she could stay there by herself until the lease was up and she'd have to move out by then. They came back to their old place a month later to see that Tina had gotten back with her ex, started using again, and had robbed them blind. Found all this out from another coworker, and when I asked why they were telling me and not our friends, their response was they were too embarrassed to admit that you were right. Story 30. I apologize in advance for the length of my story. I worked for a major printer company. I was project manager setting up a direct ship to the customer in the U.S. process from our manufacturing plant in Mexico, think NAFTA. 3 months into my project, our sister division decides to do the exact same thing. I go to their meetings so we can collaborate and work through all the legal hoops required to cross the border. 6 weeks of meetings and the sister division is still all hype and discussing all the savings. They are severely annoyed by me with all my detail questions, so I tell my director 2 levels above me that these meetings are wasting my time, and I'm just going to focus on my own project. 5 months later, sister division starts shipping 30 trucks per day, and I'm still a month away from my first truck shipment. My director calls me in and berates me for lollygagging and being inefficient. I tell him that I'm not sure how the sister division was able to get all the government approvals and US customs clearances aligned so quickly, and my project was actually going to be about 3 weeks late. Did not go over well. About 6 weeks after our conversation, I ship my first truck and it gets stuck in customs. It took 3 days and 100 phone calls and a small mountain of paperwork to clear it. But it then went on to the various customers. We then started shipping 3 trucks per day with minimal delays a week later, and it's running like clockwork. Turns out the sister division stopped their shipping after 150 trucks were stuck at the border, and several $1 million worth of printers were not going to customers. It took 7 months before they cleared their first truck and cost them roughly $5 million to recover, and they had a lot of pissed off customers. My project saved us about $500,000 by the end of the year and about $3 million per year going forward. A few weeks into our success, I went back to my director and just said that the reason why my project took so long was because we knew what we were doing and we did it right. He quietly agreed. Story 31. Body shop manager was writing estimates on vehicles, ordering parts, and letting the customer take the vehicle to return at a later date. I don't like pre-ordering parts because there are too many risks. This went on for months while pre-ordered parts were piling up. I kept bringing it up to our GM and the body shop manager, telling him many of these parts had been sitting there so long they were beyond their return window. They didn't care, basically telling me not to worry about it. Flash forward a few more months, and the body shop manager quit. New body shop manager starts calling these customers to get them to come in. Many had their vehicles repaired elsewhere due to us never getting back with them. Some were involved in another wreck totaling them. Some were traded in or sold. Body shop had to write off tens of thousands of dollars. Should have listened to me in the first place. Story 32. When my dad was at my first place for the first time, he was busy doing things and took off his outer layer. When he came in, I asked him if he wanted his hoodie, but he declined and sat down. Not 10 minutes later, he complained that he was cold and told me to turn the heat up. I was laughing so hard I could barely get the words out, but I told him to put his sweatshirt back on. That was very satisfying. Story 33. My boss didn't believe me that someone on my team was charging hours. He wasn't actually working in the time right after COVID peaked, and things shifted to WFH. She accused me of micromanaging, and I just needed to trust him. So I did, while monitoring how often he was logging into work. When she realized he was working at most 4 hours a week and taking over a month to implement a one-line code change, they finally acknowledged I was right and took action. Story 34. I worked for a company that took private school students hiking and adventuring for short 3 to 5 day experiences. We hired a guy that had extensive outdoor experience to join the team. From when he started, I got a vibe that this guy does whatever he wants and all on his schedule, and that everyone else should consider themselves lucky that they get to work with him. I started to notice him cutting corners and doing a few things that I would consider unsafe, especially since we weren't just adventuring solo. We were doing this as our job with clients. I talked to the boss about this on several occasions, but he swept it under the rug and ignored me most times because it never eventuated to anything serious. After about a year of this, I couldn't stand it anymore and submitted an official complaint to the boss, outlining some serious safety concerns and how I had raised them before, but to no avail, and wanted my concerns on the record. As luck would have it, about 24 hours after I submitted my email, this guy blundered big time, hiked students into an area I had repeatedly told him they shouldn't go because of poor access in the event of an emergency, and took them swimming in a flowing river. This was not the first time he had done this, I later found out, but he had just been able to get away with it. However, this time the river was up and flowing more than usual. Half of the group was swept away in the river and were separated from him fortunately. Nobody was seriously hurt, but one young lady was hurt enough that she required evacuation. This was made extremely difficult given the area they were in and the fact that the group was separated by fast-flowing water. I later found out that the two halves of the group both thought that the other half had perished because many hours went by before the new guy was able to make contact with the half that wasn't swept away. Poor kids. I'm all for adventure, which is why I love the job, but there were so many warning signs that he and my boss ignored. Story 35. Teacher here. Had district personnel doing walk thoughts in my room looking for student collaboration. One boy sits alone. They were upset he wasn't sitting with a group. I told them he really can't. To which they said, I bet he can. I just looked at them and moved on. No more than 2 minutes later, we are working out problems and I go to check his. He made a computation mistake, so I said, student, go check your multiplication. You made a mistake with your second partial product. Kid looks at me, yells, bro, it ain't wrong, and proceeds to flip his chair. I looked at the visitors and just shrugged my shoulders. Yes, this child is receiving behavioral services, and it is recommended he sit away from peers due to outbursts. Story 36. I was idly bouncing an incredibly dull knife against my leg. When I say dull, I mean that it struggled to cut a banana. A friend happened to notice what I was doing and said, "That's super dangerous." I shrugged and said, "It's too dull to even make it through my apron," and punctuated my point with another, harder bounce, stabbing myself in the leg. It turns out a paring knife without an edge can still have a point, much as my friend did. Story 37. When my toddler insisted to me that she wouldn't get muddy after sneaking outside during rain, while wearing new light-colored pajamas, and wearing flip-flops on the wrong feet. 5 minutes later, she was camouflaged with two eyes peeking out. Story 38. I was operations manager for a very small family-run company. I was putting in 80 HR weeks, rarely getting a full day off. One new employee had trouble completing their job, which was extremely easy, and kept interrupting me while I was doing one of my jobs. I told them to go ask one of my bosses, since she knew exactly what to do. Later that day, I got called into the office and was asked if I thought my pay rate was too much for what I was doing. I asked the boss what they meant by that, and they said, "I don't think you are worth the amount we are already paying you, since you can't handle the job you have." I asked if they meant telling the new guy to go ask them about something on their contract, and they said yes. It's lazy and unprofessional to have someone interrupt the owner when they are working. I walked out to catch some air, and literally received a call for an interview at a much higher paying job that I had applied for about a year earlier. I told the person on the phone that I could literally do the interview that day, if needed. They agreed, and I took a break and drove up to the interview and walked out with a job. I came back to work and put in my 2 weeks notice and said, "If you think I'm not worth my weight, that's okay, but you'll need at least 4 people to replace me." 2 months later, they had to hire 5 people just to handle what I did. Story 39. Girlfriend weird. My husband is tight-fisted as he insists on no major purchases and separate bank accounts. Weird. He has no major hobbies or addictions. I wonder where his money's going. Me. He has another family. Argument, argument. You know nothing. Mind your own business, you're crazy. Me. Okay. 5 months later. Guess who's revealed? Side piece got behind in bills and suddenly hubby of the year is real. Hey, like wow. Let's combine our money, it'll be totally cool. Story 40. A bit of background info first. Australia has an award system in place to set minimum pay rates for entire industries. Individual companies can have enterprise bargaining agreements, but they must be better than the award for that industry. I worked for a company for a bit over 3 years, and they decided to restructure a bit. They sent a new manager to our branch for reasons unknown, displacing the old manager, just because. This gave a few people the shits, including me, and I asked this new manager what award I was employed under. A week later, he handed me a sheet of paper saying I was a storeman employed under a Wool Stores award, which was odd, because it was a company that did entertainment lighting, and I regularly took equipment out to do gigs. So I investigated. I looked up the federal government award database and found that this company was actually covered by an entertainment industry award, and not only had they lied to me, they had been underpaying me for 5 years. I reported them to the government along with reams of evidence in the form of 3 years' worth of timesheets and payslips which I had, because I used to work on Saturdays by myself, so had unfettered access to the branch office, and they decided to mediate the dispute instead of prosecuting. Oh well, the new manager had one meeting, passed the information on to the owners, and that's when they stopped responding, so I had no choice but to sue them in the Industrial Magistrates Court for underpayment. At this point, word got around the company that I was suing them, and I became the biggest in the world to everyone else who worked at the other branches. Then they fired me, so I sued them for retaliation, and they settled that, but the first suit was still ongoing. I won. The judge was scathing in his judgment, and he made them pay me the full amount plus interest. Now everyone thought I was an even bigger. About 2 years later, the company went bust, and it came out that they hadn't been paying employee superannuation for 10 years. All those people who thought I was they missed out on tens of thousands of dollars in superannuation. A couple of years later, someone mentioned the company in a pro-lighting forum, and one of the other ex-employees responded to the post with that company doesn't exist anymore. I don't think I'll ever see my super. I just replied to him with, I could say something here, but I won't. Story 41. My brother and I were trying to convince my mom to quit her awful job for months. She is fine, but she ended up having 2 strokes with how much that job raised her already high blood pressure.